Good evening, everyone. It's my great pleasure this evening to introduce Jake Dalzell. Jake has had an extraordinary interest in and aptitude for natural history and science since he was very young. I was fortunate to first meet him and accompany him in the field 6 years ago when he was a sixth former, and since then he has read natural sciences at the University of Cambridge and graduated last summer with a first-class honours degree. So he did extremely well. Jake has a wonderful eye for and memory of plants, pathogens, and other organisms. These skills are further enhanced by his clear photography, both in the field and through a microscope. If you've not already followed the links that Liam sent us last week, I urge you to do so. Jake's posts are immensely informative about our local environment here in Northern Ireland and further afield, Portugal, the South Atlantic, West Africa, and the Southeast Asian tropics. His descriptions are of a very high scientific standard, but also hugely enjoyable to read and accessible for those with no specialist knowledge. So don't be put off by the exoticism of some of his posts. Jake is an experienced kayaker and in the summer of 2022 recorded the flora of 12 islands in Strangford Lough. Many of them never surveyed before, and it forced him to get to grips with plant groups like grasses, sedges, rushes, and St. John's worts, all those things that we dread having to key out and identify. And he says it's made him a better botanist and field worker. So he'll tell you about that. Without further ado, I will hand over to Jake to describe for us his survey of the Strangford Lough Islands. Thank you very much, Jake.
Hello. So as Caroline said, in 2022, I visited a lot of the islands in Strangford Lough in the western part of the loch. And I put them all up on the screen here. So to kind of get you oriented, this is Coinchi on the left of the screen, and then on the coast is White Rock. And the island that's connected by a causeway is Skettrick, which has Daft Eddies, which is quite a well-known restaurant. So the islands sort of, yeah, just off the coast of White Rock were the ones I visited. So I guess something that a lot of people wonder when I talk about this project is why I might be interested in visiting islands. I suppose for me, initially, the main reason was as an excuse to go kayaking a lot for the summer. But there are also some maybe more genuine reasons. So these islands are in the north part of County Down, which is a very intensively farmed area. And a lot of the semi-natural habitats that would have been widespread in the past have been lost on the mainland. And a lot of those habitats have been retained on these islands. So things like species-rich grassland, a very small area of heath, a lot of salt marsh, which has in parts of the loch been affected by farming as well, and also some ancient woodland, which we'll talk about later. So yeah, that's part of the interest. So they retain botanical interest that has really been lost on the mainland. And part of that is due to the traditional farming practices that local farmers still use on these islands, because they're obviously remote and hard to access, and they haven't been sprayed with herbicides or pesticides, and there hasn't been any fertilizer applied other than dung from the animals themselves, the grazing livestock. So yeah, it's going out to some of these islands feels a bit like a step back in time in a lot of ways. And the other reason that really attracted me to these islands was the idea of like island biogeography, which was a really popular academic field, like, I don't know, 60 years ago, a long time ago. islands were seen as these kind of living laboratories for how dispersal and extinction lead to differences in biodiversity between different areas, which we'll talk about later. So they're really interesting from that perspective as well. So yeah, and then the other reason why I was really interested in these islands is because they're very underrecorded. So in being isolated from the mainland by water, they are hard to access. And so most, I would say, have had no records, I think, before I visited them. And only one or two had more than maybe one record. So they're very, very under-recorded areas. They are hard to get to, but as I said, I love kayaking, so that made it relatively easy. So the history of recording this area goes back a surprisingly long way, all the way back to Robert Lloyd Prager in 1923, who he basically traveled all of Ireland and recorded the plants that he saw. And in 1923, he visited Shamrock Island, and he recorded Atriplex portulacoides, or C. purslane, which is still there. It's a very common shore plant around Strangford Lough. So maybe not a particularly exciting record, but it's nice that the connection between such a famous botanist from the first part of the last century, there's still a connection there now, which I quite like, because Robert Prager was one of the people whose like work inspired me to become a botanist in the first place. So I think that's quite cool. Moving forward, there were sort of casual records here and there through the 20th century. Someone visited an island at some point and recorded one or two species. And then in the 1980s and 1990s, there was more systematic recording on Dara Island, which is this sort of strange shaped one in the south, which is owned by the National Trust. And they did this big survey covering a lot of their land on the loch, and they recorded lots of different species. So I guess we'll talk about that now. Yeah, so Dara is made up of 3 different drumlins, 3 different small hillocks, and it's dominated by grassland, and there's also a lot of scrub, and there's a lot of bracken. And I think it's really interesting that we have this record of what habitats were there and what plants were there in and around the 1990s, and we can compare it to now and maybe think about how management and grazing has affected those habitats and plants. So this is from the report from I think it's 1995 or 1998, the late 90s. This is a digitized version of it. And what they found was a lot of species versus grassland. It's kind of been seen as like the gem of maybe all of the islands of Strangford, not just the ones in this part of the loch. So there's a lot of species versus grassland, some scrub, some bracken. And they found species like early purple orchid, which apparently in the late 80s was quite abundant on the island. They found lots of common spotted orchid. They found devil's bit scabious. They found a small area of heath. At the time, the reason for the survey was to try and sort of optimize the management that the National Trust was doing with their land up the loch. So at the time, the plan was to keep the grazing as it was, which was sort of 3 or 4 goats, and 3 or 4 goats to keep the scrub down, which were feral goats that they'd been there for a long time, who knows how long, and cattle grazing in the winter. And that was the grazing regime up until something like 2012. So before I first started visiting, the goats were culled and I think replaced with sheep. I think the idea was to replace the goats with sheep, and the sheep would keep on the scrub instead of the goats. yeah. So the current situation is there's a flock of sheep year-round and there's cattle in the winter. So when I visited, well, the font's changed, it's fine. When I visited, this was the situation. So it's pretty much the same. I've just used different colors for everything, which is maybe a bit unhelpful, but dominated by grassland. And we have these really interesting rush pasture habitats, which are sort of in like a, I don't even know what color that is, like a bluey green, and big patches of irises, and lots of scrub. Uh, so yeah, so the most interesting habitat when I was there, which is quite unique in this part of County Down, on this side of the loch at least, is this sort of heath, which there's a very small area of on the northern drumlin. And what makes this heath especially special is the presence of this rare sedge, Carex caryophyllea, or spring sedge. This is it in flower. Yeah, and you can sort of see it. It flowers quite early in the year, and then you can see the seeds in sort of late spring, early summer. So that's something really special that really makes the island special. And then the other two things, I guess, which are really special about this island is the rush pasture. So rush pasture is kind of like a grassland with like a damp grassland with a lot of rushes. I guess that's kind of self-explanatory, but this is in the picture in the middle, sneezewort, which is a close relative of the yarrow, and it's surrounded by these rushes, which are either Juncus articulatus, which is jointed rush, or Juncus acutiflorus, which is sharp-clawed rush, or maybe the hybrid between them. I couldn't work out which one it was. And then this is also the habitat which supported the island's common spotted orchids. So yeah, so that's probably the richest habitat on the island. And then there's also this really interesting reliquial ancient woodland flora. So there's lots of pignut, which is the sort of feathery leaves in the bottom right, and wood sorrel, which is this plant with, well, you actually can't really see the pignut, but the wood sorrel, which is the white flowers with these trifoliate leaves. And there's also primroses and bluebells. So that kind of suggests a connection to like a sort of wooded past, that the vegetation in the scrub on the island is originally vegetation that's been there since the island was covered by woodland. Yeah, so I think that's quite an interesting connection to recent history. So yeah, so comparing to the National Trust survey, the main change is goats to sheep. And what's happened since that change in management was made is the early purple orchids are gone. So I'm not really sure why that happened, because they were never there when I started visiting in about 2016. And then the common spotted orchids have declined and then disappeared. So I think that's probably due to sheep grazing. Sheep quite like eating common spotted orchids. And the area of rush pasture has also shrunk quite a bit there. So it's quite an interesting one from a like management perspective. Yeah. Okay. Oh yeah, and then so this is just to show the current distribution of spring sedge. So it's the darker squares are more recent. So it's declining, and it's declining where it is found, and also the area where it's found is also shrinking. But there are a few decent sites for it in County Down, including Dara Island. So yeah, so moving on from Dara, I'd like to talk now about some of the more unusual grasslands. I think Dara is interesting because those habitats have been lost elsewhere in County Down, but some of the other islands are interesting because they have habitats that were probably never present anywhere else, and they're quite unique. So I'll take you to Drummond, which is sort of on the eastern fringe of this group of islands. And it's full of this really, really species-rich and very unusual grassland that's dominated by tall herbs. So on the left, there is the type of grassland which dominates most of the island, which has lots of hogweed and which is the white umbellifer, which is the seed heads at the top. That's all hogweed. And then the purple is common knapweed, which is the sort of thistly looking thing. So it's really unusual to see such an open grassland that's really, really dominated by these tall herbs. And there's so much light penetrating through that it is actually quite a species-rich habitat. So there's also lady's bedstraw, which is the yellow sort of foamy plant in the middle there. And then, so that area is grazed by cattle in the winter, and it's also grazed by geese in the summer. I think that is the main reason why you get such an unusual habitat on this island and on some of the other islands, is the fact that there are geese grazing in the summer. So Strangford Lough has a lot of different types of geese. It has a lot of Canada geese actually, which are introduced. It has a lot of Brent geese, and I think pink-fronted geese. But if you visit in sort of like late summer, there'll be flocks of sort of somewhere in the hundreds on a lot of these islands. So what I think is happening is the plants that are here would suggest that it's quite a nutrient-rich habitat. There's a lot of nitrogen in the soil, and there's a lot of vigorous growth of plants. But what you would usually expect when that happens is real dominance of grasses, and you don't get that here. So my sort of theory, my hypothesis is that the geese are eating the grass preferentially, which leads to the dominance of hogweed and knapweed. And because they're eating the grasses, that lets a lot more light through the sward, which is why you get quite high species richness with things like lady's bedstraw, which requires really high light to persist. Yeah, and then on the right, it's kind of a similar situation, but this is actually where a lot of seabirds nest. So the geese nest in this area, and it's really dominated by knapweed again in purple, and then the white is actually sneezewort here, the plant we saw earlier in the rush pasture. So that's kind of a similar, I think that's a similar thing again. But those are really plants that you wouldn't normally see in such high densities, or together necessarily at all. So yeah, you're getting these really strange tall herb communities that are really unlike anything I've ever seen anywhere else in the world, or even that anyone else has seen, to be honest. I've never really read about anything like it. So I think that's a really interesting place. Yeah. So another thing that really sets these islands apart from the rest of County Down is ponds. So in most of County Down, you have these drumlins. So you have sort of rolling hills and lochs in between. And it's really heavily grazed by cattle, and particularly there's a lot of dairy farming. And the cattle are mostly watered at troughs. So there really aren't many ponds in County Down. There are a lot more sort of small lochs and things. But the sort of smaller ponds you get on these islands, I think, have been dug by people in order to provide water for livestock. So you get a lot of plants growing in these ponds that aren't particularly common in the area. So this is on Dunsey Island, which actually isn't in the satellite image, it's slightly further south. And this is beside a pond where you have a lot of trampling by livestock. You get this interesting flushing where water's coming to the surface. And flushes are where you often find a lot of interesting plants. So in this case, the light green leaves here are ivy-leaved water crowfoot, Ranunculus hederaceus, which is reasonably common, to be fair, in County Down, but it's not very common. So I thought that was interesting. Yeah, so this is the kind of thing that I saw on Dunsey. So these sort of rounded ivy-like leaves are the water crowfoot, and then this is a really common species that grows on mud called brookline, Veronica beccabunga, which is an aquatic species of speedwell. And you can see these little starry white flowers are the water crowfoot. This is on Drummond again, so the more unusual one that's heavily grazed by geese. And this is the pond in sort of midsummer. And you can see it's really, really heavily trampled by seabirds. There's a lot of guano going into the pond. So you can imagine how like rich in nitrates and phosphate the soil is here. It's quite an extreme environment, to be honest. It's almost like a slurry pit or something. Yeah, I was a bit worried about getting bird flu when I was here because I saw a dead seagull. So I was slightly concerned that I was going to get bird flu, but I didn't, so it was fine. Yeah, so you can imagine, so there's really, really high nutrients here. There's a lot of disturbance. And when you get to later in the summer, this mud, once it stops being disturbed by the trampling of the geese, it really bursts into life. So this was later summer. I think this is late August, early September. And that whole surface of mud has just been completely covered in these really rapidly growing annuals that thrive in the high nutrient conditions and provided by the dung of the birds. So the yellow is Roripa palustris, which I think is water yellow cress. And the pink is Persicaria maculosa, which is breadshank. Yeah, so they're reasonably common species. The Roripa isn't like especially abundant in County Down, but it's unusual to see such a large area just completely carpeted in them. And as you can imagine, this place was like buzzing with bees and hoverflies. That's the Roripa, the water yellow cress. So its distribution in Ulster and the northern half of Ireland is really concentrated around Lough Neagh. This is kind of an eastern outpost of it. And then this was probably the most interesting pond species I saw. So there are definitely a lot of places in the world where this is a really common species. This is in the spinach family, and it's called red goosefoot Oxybasis rubra. And it's another species that grows on the damp, relatively nutrient-rich mud that the birds and livestock leave behind. And this is actually on quite a lot of the islands, maybe 3/4 of the islands I visited. And it's really quite uncommon in this part of the world. So there's a few sites, a few recent records from around Lough Neagh and a few from around Strangford Lough, and then bits and pieces here and there. But yeah, a pretty uncommon plant. So I thought that was a really interesting thing to see, and particularly because it was on so many of the different islands. So onto a quite different habitat. So the ponds are very dynamic and there's a lot of disturbance. And this habitat, ancient woodland, is more interesting because of the lack of disturbance. So there was only one island that I visited that had ancient woodland on it, and it's the one just north of Skettrick. So in the top left here, between Skettrick and this is I think Mahee Island that Nendra monastic site is on, is this one Rainy in the middle. So it's just between Daft Eddies and and the mansions that are on the south side of Mahee Island. It's quite an interesting place to kayak around. And in the middle drumlin of Rainy is this really incredible ancient woodland. So it has these really, really huge oak trees, which were probably well, I have no idea how old they are, but some of them are definitely over 100 years old at least. Yeah, so really big oak trees, and there's quite rich woodland ground flora. So you have all the typical species. You have primrose, wood sorrel, lesser celandine. There's also lots of bluebells. There's yellow pimpernel as well, which I don't have a clue of, unfortunately. And you also have this quite relatively uncommon plant, which is hemp nettle, Galliopsis tetrahit ag. I haven't worked out which species. It's like an aggregate of several very similar species, so I haven't worked out which one it is yet. Yeah, so that's one of the most interesting habitats I think that I saw. And although the woodland in the area is now restricted to rainy, when we go back into like historical records, we can see that it was formerly much more widespread, and that maybe explains why I found woodland ground flora on Dara Island. In fact, Dara Island, or it was previously anglicized as Island Dara, comes from Ilan Dara, which means oak or Oakwood Island. So you can actually see in the place names that link to a wooded path. So this area around the time of the plantations of Ulster was actually quite sparsely populated. A lot of the coastline was densely populated, but bits and pieces weren't, and all of the islands obviously weren't. So by the time of the plantation of Ulster, this became part of the Clandy estate, and the woodland around here was a really large continuous area called Dufferin Wood that was mapped by Raven's survey in 1625, which was commissioned by the new lord, I guess, who was in charge of the Clandy estate. So they actually found really extensive woodland in the area, which is quite interesting. And you can see these red stars I've marked where there was formerly woodland in the 17th century that's no longer present. So I think in Ireland in general, we often think of ancient woodland as being restricted to like a few small areas and like Killarney and very remote areas. But actually North Down until only 400 years ago really had quite a lot of woodland, which I found very surprising when I was researching this. So I've come to biogeography, which was a way I found of maybe bringing all the plants that I saw on the various islands, a lot of which weren't necessarily the most exciting species, and bringing them together and maybe finding more interesting patterns in how the islands differ in terms of their biodiversity. So island biogeography is this branch of ecology that arose in the 20th century and aims to understand how processes like colonization and extinction affect the differences in biodiversity between different areas. So because islands are completely isolated from each other and from the mainland, and they make for a really good system to study, because you kind of don't have species just walking on, not in the case of plants, obviously, but you don't have species just kind of showing up and disappearing quite so often as you would if you took like a random field. They're sort of relatively stable in what species are present and what species aren't. So what affects the species richness or the biodiversity of an island? So the first thing is dispersal limitation. What dispersal limitation means is that plants, if you imagine plants, they don't just disperse everywhere. So if you have a plant growing on the mainland, just because it's growing on the mainland doesn't mean it's going to be on every nearby island. There's a limit to how far its seeds can spread, which means that there will be differences between different areas because the plants in those different areas aren't just immediately spreading everywhere. So yes, that's kind of that's kind of just, it kind of seems obvious, but it's just a way of saying that the differences between islands are because plants can't immediately spread between them. Connectivity is the idea that some islands are more connected than others, which in the case of these ones just means they're closer together. So if they're closer together, a given plant's seeds are more likely to spread from one island to the other. And then area is, well, I'm sure you know what area is, but the relevance of area is that if you have a larger area, that becomes a larger target for incoming seeds. So you'll have more species colonizing. And if you have a larger area as well, a given plant species will have a larger population. So the likelihood of it going extinct is lower. Yeah, and then you can kind of summarize, the word that summarizes these is metapopulation dynamics. So a lot of people went and studied a lot of islands in the 20th century, and they found this really, really consistent pattern. So when you have a small island versus a large island, the extinction rate on the small island will be higher because a given plant species has a smaller population. So the chance of just all of the plants that year happening to die is higher if there are less plants. So on a larger island, that's less likely to happen because a given plant species will have more different individuals. So the chance of them all dying through random chance or some environmental disaster is lower. Island is near the mainland or further from the mainland, or in fact, larger or smaller again, will have different rates of colonization. So plants can come in at a higher rate if an island is near the mainland, and they can also come in at a higher rate if it's larger. So there's like a larger target for seeds to hit. And over time, these two effects reach an equilibrium, which leads to the observed pattern that larger islands and more connected islands have a higher species richness. I hope that makes sense. Feel free to ask questions about that at the end. So what this means is we would predict from our theoretical basis, and that theoretical basis comes from these observations over many different island groups, that islands which are larger have more species. And that is, in fact, what we find. I mean, it's not entirely surprising, I think, from a vibes-based perspective, that a larger island would have more species, but it's quite amazing how consistent the pattern is. So when you plot this graph, so number of species on the y-axis and area on the x-axis, and they've been log transformed, which just makes the graph a straight line rather than a curve. You find this really, really, really consistent pattern. And I only visited, I think there's 13 islands in that graph. So I haven't even visited that many islands, and already the pattern is really, really strong. So I find that quite compelling. It shows the power of ecological theory. But what I also find interesting about this is that line is the expected species richness, the number of species we would expect to find on an island of a given area. So if an island is above that line, it means it has more species than we would expect. And if an island is below that line, it means it has less species than we would expect if we're only looking at the area. So we can take the distances between each island and the line and plot them again. And that sort of shows us the what's called the residual variance. So that's the difference between the expected species richness and the actual species richness for a given area. So why I think that's interesting is it shows that some islands are more species rich than others, even when we account for how big the island is. So Shamrock wins out, actually. Shamrock has the most species for its size, followed closely by Dara, and actually Drummond and Roe, which I find some of the nicest islands to visit, interestingly enough, come out as surprisingly species per. So I think that's quite interesting, and it maybe suggests that the management on some islands could maybe be optimized. Obviously, there are other things affecting the species richness of the islands, but it suggests that the management of some of the islands can maybe be more optimal than it currently is, because they're sort of lagging behind the others. So that kind of takes us into conservation. So I spoke a bit about Dara and maybe how the grazing regime is currently not quite what it could be. And I'm going to talk about a different island now. So Dara is National Trust zone. This one is privately owned. I was lucky enough to get access to. This is Shamrock, which is actually the one that's the most species rich for its size. Yeah, so Shamrock is a really interesting island. It's circled in red. It's in Ballymorn Bay, which is this small bay near Coinche. And it's a very, very flat island. So a lot of these islands are quite steep drumlins. Shamrock is incredibly flat. And what that means is you have this really, really shallow slope into the sea, and you have this really nice gentle gradation from scrub to sort of slightly brackish grassland to rushy salt marsh to lower, really short salt marsh, and then into the mud flats of the bay. And it actually has a sort of enclosed inlet that's almost entirely enclosed by land, but that's covered by high tide each day. And it's this really, really nice salt marsh. I love the salt marsh on Shamrock, to be honest. And it has these interesting pools as well, which you see like dragonflies and stuff flying around in the summer. Yeah, and that's the same enclosed bit of salt marsh. So the resolution isn't great on the screen, but the sort of liney pale green line, quite vertical plants are Salicornia or glasswort or marsh samphire is what you hear it called in restaurants, which is this salt marsh annual. And then the purple is sea lavender, which is a perennial. And it's a pretty typical community that you would find on this lower salt marsh that's covered by high tide. The upper salt marsh of Shamrock is really notable actually because it has this quite uncommon plant called parsley leaf water dropwort, Enanthe lachinalii, which is this white umbellifer. And this is fairly uncommon. So here it's growing in the upper part of the salt marsh, which is dominated by Juncus murtimus, or actually I don't know what the English is, like seaside rush or something. So it is salt marsh and it is covered by spring tides, but it's quite it's relatively fresh water for most of the year. And you get this really unique community. Yeah, so this is the distribution of Enanthe lachinalii. So it's a pretty uncommon plant. There's a decent amount in County Down actually, because County Down has a relatively good amount of this kind of upper salt marsh, which requires pretty gentle seas. Yeah, and then I've also seen it over in Sligo, but there's not a whole lot in this part of Ireland, to be honest. So that's quite a special thing to see. The other thing that's notable about this salt marsh, so this is a very common species, the six-spot burnet moth, Zygina. I can't remember which one it is, but anyway, six-spot burnet moth. So that's really common. That's a really common species of like species-rich grasslands. But what's notable here is the density. So there aren't loads of plants that can tolerate the salinity, the like slight salinity of the upper salt marsh here. But one thing that can is common bird-foot trefoil, which is the food plant of sixbell burnet, and is really, really, really dense. So the burnet moths themselves are really, really, really dense. Like you can get 15 cocoons per square meter or something ridiculous, which I've never seen. It's pretty unusual to see that. So I just thought it was kind of notable. And you also get, so I'm moderately confident, but not really, that this is Catesia zyginarum, which is a wasp which parasitizes the caterpillars of six-spot burnet. So the wasp injects its eggs into the caterpillars, and something like maybe 15 larvae develop inside the caterpillar. And then when a caterpillar climbs up, so in this case, this is one of the rushes, Juncus maritimus, the caterpillar climbs up to form its own cocoon, or it thinks it's going to form its own cocoon. And then all of a sudden, all the larvae burst out and make their own cocoons, which is pretty gross. Yeah, so that's a braconid wasp. Braconid wasps tend to have quite a lot of larvae within the one caterpillar host. So that wasp, I'm not sure it is Catesia, but anyway, it's a braconid wasp. It's pretty common to see that, but yeah, I just thought it was kind of interesting, like the connection between the wasp being pretty common and the host of the wasp being pretty common, the moth. And then the reason the moth is common is because the soil is quite brackish and you get so much bird-foot trefoil. So, oh yeah, so I meant to be talking about conservation. So the reason why I was talking about the salt marsh is because the salt marsh in this area of the loch, and in fact in the entire loch, is sort of threatened by an invasive grass, Spartina anglica, now Sporobolus anglicus, which is common cord grass, I think. So this sort of green finger that's extending into the mudflat here is a solid stand of Spartina. It's really, really, really dense. It's really dominant, and actually quite not really a whole lot else grows amongst it. This is, to have a picture. So this is kind of, okay, I don't have a picture until the next one, so apologies for this really bad picture. But this is the seed head of the grass, and this grass is actually a new species, like an evolutionarily new species. So one of the it's a hybrid species. So one of the parents is native to the southeast of England, and the other parent is native to the east coast of North America. And the North American species was introduced to the south of England. And at some point in the 19th century, the two species hybridized, and they actually formed a stable allotetraploid hybrid, which means that the offspring took the entire genome of one parent and the entire genome of the other parent and just put them all together in one cell, which means you don't get, so normally hybrids are infertile, but because you take the entire genome of both, it means it can be fertile and become a new species because it then can't interbreed with either of the parents. Yeah, so since something like the later part of the 19th century, this species has been spreading really aggressively in salt marshes throughout northwestern Europe. And it's become really dominant in large areas of Strangford Lough. And the reason why I have this picture on the left here is to show that not only has the grass come in, but its parasite, which is also not native to Ireland, has come in. So this large brown lump on the inflorescence of the Spartina is Claviceps spartini, which is an ergot. So ergots are these fungi which form they form these large sort of distended structures on the inflorescences of grasses. and that structure then falls to the ground and produces spores that then infect more grasses the next year. So that's not a native species. That because Ireland didn't have any Spartina species until this one was introduced, that has come in from England, presumably where Spartina, one of the parent species, was native. And so I actually took this on Shamrock, which is why I included it. So the orange, sorry, the PowerPoint has changed from my laptop, but the orange that you can see at the base of the ergot is another fungus called Fusarium heterosporum, which is a parasite of the ergot. So it's actually a hyperparasite. So you have the ergot parasitizing the grass, and you have the Fusarium parasitizing the ergot. And the Fusarium is actually a native species. So I thought that was quite cool because you have a non-native grass coming in, a non-native fungus which infects the grass, but actually a native fungus infecting the non-native fungus. So you have this really interesting kind of reorganization of interactions because of invasive species coming in. Pretty cool. Similarly, so it's changing how species interact. It's also changing how sediment dynamics in the loch change over time. So I showed that large sort of finger of Spartina extending into the mudflat, and this is looking in the other direction, basically from that finger out over the mudflat. And what you can see is there's a lot of sediment buildup, which I suppose you wouldn't be able to tell if you hadn't been there before, but this used to be a much rockier area, and this mud flat has really built up over the past maybe 10 years. And what's really interesting is it's been colonized, actually. So this green is seagrass, Zostera species, which are marine plants. They're quite unusual because they're flowering plants. They have flowers, but they grow in seawater, which is, yeah, there aren't many plants that can do that. So the Spartina has changed the sediment dynamics, and you've got this sedimentation, this new mudflat forming, and you have a native species which is actually quite threatened. And these seagrass beds have been destroyed in a lot of parts of the loch. So sort of ironically, the Spartina has facilitated this new habitat forming, which is actually a really valuable habitat for marine animals, like fish. Particularly, a lot of young fish will hide in seagrass meadows. So I thought it was interesting because it sort of shows that you can't just, the solution to these invasive species isn't just like get rid of them immediately. You have to kind of consider how they've reorganized the ecosystem and how we can remove the Spartina without destroying the seagrass bed. I don't have a solution to that, but I'm open to suggestions. Yeah, so on to more terrestrial habitats. A lot of the islands I visited are really dominated, the ones that aren't grazed are really dominated by this tall grass, which is false oak grass, Arenaphorum eladius. When a grassland isn't grazed, it goes through a process called succession, where different species become dominant and it turns into something else. So most grasslands in this part of the world, when they aren't grazed, will slowly become dominated by false oak grass, and then probably be invaded by brambles, which you can see in the background, and then eventually turn into scrub and then woodland. Yeah, where it's right at sea level, you do get occasional incursions at very high spring tides of seawater, which tends to kill the scrub. So it's actually it's stuck in a state of also grass dominated grassland, which is quite species per. So Shamrock is interesting because the management has been changed to try and break up some of this false oak grassland and encourage more species-rich grassland to recover. So there aren't livestock on Shamrock. So the way to do that is through mowing once a year with a scythe. It's very hard work. So this is an area of grassland on Shamrock that was mown, and yeah, so these are some of the species that we're trying to encourage. So there's lots of common birds which are foil, there's lots of lady's bedstraw, there's lots of common knapweed, and there's also some slightly less common species like pignut, and those are in turn favoring the nice grassland insects like common blue and small copper butterflies, which are pretty common species, but they're in decline because of the lack of these habitats. So yeah, I suppose the takeaway from this is that the islands are marginal habitats, and a lot of them haven't been managed in a long time, the ones that haven't been grazed, but they have a really, really high potential for restoration because they've never been sprayed with fertilizers. And once you change the management, these things very rapidly recover, which is nice. Oh yeah, and sorry, this is me. I'm trying to cram in as many pathogens as possible. So on the knapweed, the purple plant, there's I found this. This is an oomycete, which is, they look like fungi, but they're not. And this sort of white, it really looks like icing sugar, I think, if you see it on the real leaves. And this is an oomycete called Bremia centaurii. This is like the 4th Irish record or something. It's probably really common, but no one records these things. So I thought that was cool. Just showing that like you have grassland species and they're kind of facilitating the flourishing of many other species that we don't really think about that much when we think about conservation. So yeah, hopefully the Bremia stays. Yeah, long may it live. Okay, that is kind of the end of the talk. Yeah, I hope you got sort of a slight feel for the islands. There's so many more things I could talk about on the islands, to be honest, which I guess is what the questions are for. But I really want to say a huge thank you to the landowners for letting me come on their land. Yeah, that was kind of the entire project. So that was pretty essential. I'm eternally grateful. I also want to say a big thanks to my dad, Keith Dalzell, who helped with kayaking, sort of like organizing kayaking and like safety and stuff. To the Vice County Recorder for County Down, Graham Day, who helped immensely with species ID and like verifying records. I learned lots. I learned a huge amount from him. Also, funding from the VSBI. Really grateful that I got a advanced study grant from the VSBI. If anyone is an undergrad, I highly recommend applying. It's very easy to apply, and it's really useful funding. My friend Wayne Yang, who helped with stats and stuff, he's an endlessly interesting person to have conversations with, and I've learned a huge amount from him. And many more other people who helped with background research, getting access to like National Trust reports or like verifying old records and things like that. Yeah, I've had small bits of help from a huge number of different people, so I'm really, really thankful. Thank you, and thank you all for listening.
I'm going to take questions. First question is, can you sort me out with my Zoom?
Oh yeah.
I've managed to lose it, so I can't get at the, sorry about that. You shouldn't let somebody like me loose with, I wasn't meant to do this. My daughter let me down at the last minute. Right, any questions from the hall? Yes.
Has he got a plan to resurvey those 12 islands, and if so, in what time frame?
For the benefit of the people on Zoom, the question was, have you got a time? Do you intend to, sorry, could you repeat that? I told you I'd be used. Reserve it and have your time limit.
A time frame. So I don't currently have a plan to resurvey the islands. There's a whole lot of other, this is only like, so I think I fully surveyed 13, and then there's one other Dunsey, which I've sort of half or a third done. So I have like a lot, there's like, I don't know, 60 or 70 islands in Strangford Lough. So I think I would prioritize visiting some of the other ones which I've heard have really nice habitats on them before I would go back and resurvey these ones, for plants anyway. But I do intend potentially to go back and look at other species. So I was maybe going to look at the different pathogenic fungi and oomycetes on the plants, and maybe look at how the species richness of those relates to things like island biogeography, because it's dependent, for them, it will be dependent on the hosts as well as those like dynamics of dispersal that I talked about earlier. So I think that might be an interesting thing to look at if I go back to the islands. Yeah, I would love to resurvey them, to be fair, but I don't have a time frame.
Any other questions? Don't be shy.
Do you want me to get the Zoom? Because I don't know how to get back onto the laptop.
This is my confession time. I managed to close my computer by mistake. And so
I don't see any questions actually.
oh, are there if anybody on Zoom has questions,
Oh, they were told to hold them to the end.
yeah,
Yeah.
could you put them into the chat now? There are 18 people at the minute on Zoom, so we will forgive you if you don't want to. There's a lot to digest in that. I find that fascinating. Has anybody? No? Right. We have. Right, Judy.
Just wondering, climate change, do you see in the next 20, 30 years, what might affect those islands? Are they a bit more robust than on the mainland?
So the question was, could there be any changes due to climate change in the next 20 to 30 years? Are the islands potentially more robust than the mainland? And what I would say is it definitely depends on the island. So some of them are very, very, very low. Shamrock in particular and Dara are pretty much at sea level, and at their highest, maybe a meter above sea level. So you could definitely see higher spring tides and just higher seas in general are going to change those. I actually don't know off the top of my head what the predicted sea level rise for the next 50 years is. But let's say it's like 50 centimeters. You could see there would be a really big change, particularly where there's a very shallow slope. A small change in sea level is going to affect a really large area. Whereas the ones that are really steep sloping, it might only affect like a really thin band around the edge of the island. So I would say for the majority of the islands I visited, probably not. But particularly for Dara and Shamrock, yeah, I could definitely see a big change due to sea level rise in particular. Comparing to the mainland, I don't know that there would be a difference, other than that they're more species-rich habitats, so they're kind of there's more to be lost. But at the same time, because it's natural, and the salt marsh plants and things can move up the slope, whereas on the mainland, they don't really have anywhere to go. And when you raise the sea level, you're starting to cover, there's roads along most of those coastlines. So you're starting to get into like farmland and stuff. So I guess, yeah, on the mainland, the salt marsh doesn't really have anywhere to move upslope, whereas on these islands it does. Yeah, so I guess they are more robust in that way.
Guys, I saw another hand up when Judy put hers up. Yes, Mike.
Yeah, I was wondering, all the plants sort of kind of acid and neutral. Do you see any evidence of things that like sort of lime? Because there's a lot of limestone in the northwest end of the loch.
Yeah.
And there are two, there's an island called Limestone Island, and there's another one called Limestone Cladding down in your neck of the woods. Is there limestone on?
So the question was, there were a lot of plants that like acid and neutral soils, and did I see any evidence of lime loving plants or basic soil loving plants? It's a good question. To be honest, no. I think there were maybe one or two areas where, so like there's fairy flax on Dara, which I would associate with sort of neutral leaning basic soils, but I wouldn't go as far as to describe the grassland as basic. I think it's more neutral and not very acidic. Because fairy flax is really the only one, and it's not really a calcicle. Like it tends to like more basic soils, but it's not like be all or end all, to be honest. Yeah.
Could you be encouraged to visit Limestone Island?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting point. Yeah. I should definitely visit. I mean, particularly because, you know, all of that material, all the soil and the rocks on the islands came from material deposited during the Ice Age. So it would be really interesting to see, because like different source rocks, which could be many, many tens of kilometers away, have been deposited in different places. And yeah, it would be interesting to look at like how that till that was deposited by ice sheets still affect what plants are present in what places now. I think that's an interesting thing to look at in the future, maybe, but not something I've looked at. Yes.
My question is, where's Limestone Island?
So the question is, where is Limestone Island?
Southwest. It's one called Limestone Island, and another one called Limestone Paddy, which we just been both of those islands.
Somewhere in the southwest of the Lough, apparently.
A lot of limestone.
You're talking to a geologist down there.
Should we take the Zoom questions on?
Oh, is there a Zoom question?
There's two.
Or two, right.
So Anne and Alistair asked, why did they change from goats to sheep? So yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not entirely 100% on that. You would have to ask the National Trust. The reason why they have sheep at all, or goats at all, the reason why they have ovids is that there isn't water full time on Dara Island, so the ponds dry up in the summer, so you can't really have cattle there during the summer. Which that type of neutral grassland, it can be quite beneficial. Like the sort of Devil's Bit scabious dominated grassland can do quite well with summer grazing of cattle. So yeah, so that's why they don't just have cattle, and they do want to keep the scrub down. If you want my honest opinion, I don't think the sheep are a good idea, because they don't effectively keep the scrub down. You can see that the scrub is spreading, even though there's like 10 or 12 sheep on the island. It's not a very big island. So they aren't really doing the job of the goats. But at the same time, if you took them off, it would probably scrub up more quickly. But then we've also lost species because of the sheep directly. So I don't know. I think something needs to change, but I am not on the National Trust Strangford Lough team, so you can ask them. The other question from Ralph Forbes is, how did you get permission to visit the islands? To cut a long story short, I asked all the landowners, or I got help from my dad to ask all the landowners. And once you know one landowner, they tend to know who owns other bits of land nearby. So it took a bit of detective work to work out who owned what. But eventually we covered everything, which was good. Yeah, that's probably not a very helpful answer, to be honest.
I think Caroline is going to give a vote of thanks.
Well, I'm sure you'll all join me in thanking Jake very much for that fascinating talk. He's shown us how a really thorough, detailed survey of 12 really quite different islands can enable him to read the vegetation and weave together a fascinating web of factors that have produced the differences island to island. There's a combination of the diversity of plants, the diversity of habitats, the effect of management. He has detected change over time, both short-term, decades, like what's known about the National Trust, and centuries, where we know that there was more ancient woodland on some of those islands in the past. And there's other indicators, even without the written record, of ancient woodland, where the understory, the herbs, have persisted even though the trees have been removed. And then he had his introduced species that have changed habitats, but lo and behold, it's actually improved the habitat for something which is quite rare. And so you have the unexpected results of something that initially is considered to be undesirable. And then this feeds into the theory of island biogeography, which I'm very pleased to see is alive and well, because my first expedition was to the British Virgin Islands in 1976. And the underlying theory that we were investigating then was island biogeography, and a paper by authors called MacArthur and Wilson, who I'm sure you're familiar with. So that's been a very persistent and very interesting theory over the decades, and the colonization of islands, dispersal by wind, water, animals, birds. And you may remember my talk about Wallace's line and the fact that you've got a very different fauna on the two sides of the line. And so that's scaling up what Jake has done, but I'm amazed at the immense detail that he's got in that really quite limited area of Strangford Lough. And it just demonstrates to us just what a fascinating environment we have on our doorstep. And that, well, there's marine zoologists in the audience, and they could come in and they could tell us all about the tidal animals, organisms in that environment as well, and add to the picture. We've just seen just the really land plant aspect of it, and with few mentions of the animals, the invertebrates that Jake brought in. So thank you very much. You have given us a tremendous description of your work, which is very impressive.